I knew something was off the moment the house smelled like expensive perfume instead of pancakes. Saturday mornings in the Knox household usually smelled of burnt batter and cheap syrup, a localized domestic disaster I actually enjoyed navigating. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. But today the air was thick with a floral scent so aggressive it felt like a physical barrier. I stood in the entryway, my firefighter boots still caked with the grime of a 12-hour shift, and listened to the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence you get after a long day of saving people from their own bad wiring. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a stage before the curtains go up. I dropped my gear bag and walked toward the kitchen. Tessa was there, but she wasn't making breakfast. She was positioned in front of a ring light that had become a permanent fixture of our dining area, her face tilted at that precise 45-degree angle she'd spent years perfecting. She was wearing a dress that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, a shimmering emerald thing that looked less like clothing and more like a statement of intent. "You're home late," she said, her eyes never leaving the small screen of her phone. Her thumb flicked upward in a rhythmic, hypnotic motion, scrolling through a sea of validation. "Structure fire on 4th, I said, rubbing the grit from my eyes. "The kind that likes to hide in the insulation. Where's Sullivan?" "In his room. He's being difficult." She finally looked at me, though I could tell she was mostly checking her reflection in the dark glass of the microwave behind me. "Wilder, don't start. I have the Zenith Gala tonight. The sponsors are expecting a full get-ready-with-me sequence, and I'm behind schedule because he wouldn't stop asking for those ridiculous dinosaur shapes." "He's 5, Tessa. Dinosaurs are his primary social currency." I walked past her, the scent of her perfume clinging to my skin like a fine mist. Sullivan's door was cracked open. I found him sitting on the edge of his bed, clutching a headless plastic triceratops. He looked up, and the relief that flooded his small face was a sharp, jagged needle in my chest. "Dad," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile peace of the hallway. "Hey, pal, I heard we're having a dinosaur crisis." I sat beside him, the mattress creaking under the weight of a man who spent his life carrying ladders and hoses. "Mommy's leaving," he said, his voice trembling. "She said she has to go to the big party and I have to stay with the sitter. But I don't like the sitter. She just looks at her phone, too." "I'm here now," I said, pulling him into a side hug. "I'll take care of it." I went back to the kitchen, feeling a familiar, cynical heat rising in my throat. This was the highlight reel of my life, a series of scenes where I played the supporting character to a woman who viewed her family as props in a lifestyle brand. Tessa was now applying a layer of gloss to her lips with the precision of a surgeon. "The sitter canceled, Tessa. I saw the text on the iPad in the hall." She froze, the gloss wand hovering an inch from her mouth. "She what? Since when?" "Since an hour ago. Which means you aren't going to the gala. I've been awake for 24 hours, and Sullivan needs a parent who isn't distracted by an algorithm." Tessa turned toward me, and for a second the influencer mask slipped. The curated warmth evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating sharpness. "I am going, Wilder. This isn't just a party, it's a contract. Derek is meeting me there, and we have a presentation with the lead investors for the new fitness app. If I don't show up, the brand is tarnished. You wouldn't understand. You just go to work and wait for a bell to ring." "I understand that our son is sitting in his room feeling like a nuisance," I said, my voice low and steady. It was the voice I used when I was trying to calm a panicked homeowner while their basement flooded. "Derek Lawson, the soccer coach, since when does he handle your investor relations?" Tessa didn't blink. "He's well connected, more than you'll ever be." She grabbed her clutch and started for the door, the emerald fabric swishing with a sound like a sliding snake. She didn't go to Sullivan's room to say goodbye. She didn't even look back at me. As the front door clicked shut, I stood in the center of our modern suburban kitchen, a room filled with high-end appliances we rarely used and marble countertops that felt like tombstones for our intimacy. I looked at the Ring camera monitor mounted on the wall. I saw her walk to her car, her stride confident and rehearsed. Then I saw a black SUV pull up to the curb. Derek Lawson was behind the wheel. He didn't get out. He just waited. Tessa climbed in, and as they pulled away, I noticed the way she leaned toward him, a gesture so fluid and natural it could only have been born from a long-standing habit. A cold, logical clarity began to settle over me. It was the same sensation I got when I arrived at a scene and realized the structure was a total loss, the moment you stop trying to save the building and start focusing on containment. "Dad?" Sullivan called out from the hallway. "Coming, Sully." I spent the next 3 hours being the father he deserved. I made the pancakes. I found the Triceratops' head. I played 3 rounds of a board game that made no sense, but the entire time, a secondary processor in my brain was humming, analyzing the data. The way Tessa had mentioned Derek, the way she had dismissed our son, the way she had looked at me, not with anger, but with the boredom one feels for a piece of outdated furniture. Around 8 o'clock, I tucked Sullivan into bed. I stayed there until his breathing turned deep and rhythmic, the sound of a child who finally felt safe. Then, I went to the living room and opened my laptop. I'm a firefighter. My job is to understand how things fall apart, how a tiny spark in a wall can grow into a roar that levels a house. I know where the load-bearing beams are. I know how to find the hidden pockets of heat. And as I looked at Tessa's public social media profile, I realized she had built her entire life out of highly flammable material. Her life was a house of cards held together by filtered photos and manufactured authenticity. She had 75,000 followers who believed she was a devoted mother and a self-made mogul. They saw the yoga poses at sunrise. They didn't see the 5-year-old crying in his room while she argued about sponsorships. I logged into our shared cloud account. Tessa was many things, but she wasn't technically savvy. She used the same password for everything, Sullivan's birthday followed by an exclamation point. It took me less than 10 minutes to find what I was looking for. The deleted folder was a goldmine. There were photos from the hotel last month when she claimed she was at a retreat in Sedona. There were messages to Derek that went back 6 months. Messages that spoke of a future that didn't include a tired firefighter or a difficult child. The cynicism I usually reserved for the bureaucracy of the city felt like a blunt instrument compared to the sharp, surgical precision of the betrayal I was witnessing. I felt a vibration in my pocket. It was a text from Claire, our neighbor from across the street. Claire was an intuitive woman, the kind who noticed when your grass was a half-inch too long or when your car stayed in the driveway for too long. "Wilder, are you home?" I stepped out onto the porch, the night air cooling the frantic heat of my thoughts. Claire was standing on her own driveway, her phone a glowing orb in her hand. She walked across the street, her expression tight with a mixture of pity and hesitation. "I saw her leave with him," Claire said, her voice barely a whisper. "And then I saw the light in your kitchen. I wasn't going to say anything, but Wilder, this isn't the first time. He's been coming around when you're on the night shift. He doesn't even park around the corner anymore." "I know," I said. It was a lie, but it felt better than admitting I'd been blind while I was busy saving other people's lives. "She left the gate open again," Claire added, pointing toward my backyard. "The one leading to the pool. Sullivan was out there earlier, before you got home. I had to walk over and tell him to go inside. Tessa was in the house with the music so loud she didn't even hear me knocking. That was the spark. The betrayal was one thing. The vanity, the infidelity, the lies, those were just flaws in the foundation. But the gate? Leaving a 5-year-old alone near deep water because you were too busy curate a digital image? That wasn't just a flaw. That was a breach of the most sacred contract a human being can sign. "Thank you, Claire," I said. My voice was different now. The sarcasm was gone, replaced by the flat, toneless resonance of a man who had just finished his assessment and was ready to work. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to do my job," I said. "I'm going to put out the fire." I went back inside and sat down at the laptop. I didn't feel the urge to scream or throw things. I felt a strange, detached sense of purpose. I began to download the footage from our own security cameras. The footage of Derek's SUV arriving at 3 a.m, the footage of Sullivan wandering aimlessly near the edge of the pool while the blue light of Tessa's ring light glowed in the window above him. I looked at the clock. The gala would be in full swing. Tessa would be standing in a room full of people who traded in the currency of appearances, laughing at Derek's jokes, feeling untouchable. She thought she had left me behind in the soot and the grime of the real world. She thought I was just the man who waited for the bell to ring. She was right about one thing. I am very good at waiting, but she forgot that I also know exactly how to use the ventilation to make a fire burn exactly where I want it to. I opened a new browser tab and began to look up the list of sponsors for the Zenith Gala. I looked at the names of the brands that paid for her emerald dress and her expensive perfume. Then I looked at the emergency custody filing forms I'd bookmarked weeks ago, back when I first felt the floorboards start to creak. I leaned back, my eyes reflecting the harsh glow of the screen. Her smile was going to falter, and I was going to be the one who made sure the camera was rolling when it did. The dashboard clock in my truck hummed with a soft amber light as the minutes ticked toward midnight. I was parked 2 blocks away from the Grand Marquis Hotel, a towering monolith of glass and vanity that looked like a jagged tooth cutting into the city skyline. This was the natural habitat of the influencer, a world of valets, velvet ropes, and the constant frantic pursuit of the perfect angle. I sat in the darkness, the engine off, listening to the cooling metal of the truck ping in the quiet air. My firefighter's training had taught me the value of a perimeter. Before you enter a hazardous environment, you observe the flow of the air, the structural integrity, and the points of egress. Right now, the marquee was the hazard, and I was the investigator. I pulled my tablet from the passenger seat. The screen was a mosaic of Tessa's digital footprint. She was live on 3 different platforms simultaneously, her face projected to thousands of strangers. In the video, she was radiant. She stood near a marble fountain, a glass of sparkling water in one hand, gesturing animatedly toward the camera. Behind her, the gala was a blur of high-end suits and evening gowns. I watched her lips move, delivering a rehearsed monologue about balance and authenticity. It was a masterpiece of fiction. To the world, she was a woman who had it all. To me, she was a woman who had left her son's safety to a neighbor's chance observation. Then the camera panned slightly, and there he was, Derek Lawson. He wasn't in the center of the frame. Tessa was too smart for that. But he was close enough to be a shadow. He looked exactly like the man people trusted with their children's soccer practice. Athletic, approachable, and possessing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was holding a tablet of his own, likely monitoring the engagement metrics as they climbed. They weren't just a couple. They were a corporation. And every corporation has a vulnerability in its supply chain. I adjusted my cap and stepped out into the night. I wasn't wearing my uniform, but I kept the mindset. I moved with the invisibility of a man who belonged in the service corridors and the shadows. I didn't head for the front entrance where the paparazzi were clustered like moths around a flame. Instead, I circled to the loading bay. Every luxury hotel has a belly, a place of laundry carts, industrial kitchens, and exhausted staff. My years in the department had given me a universal key, the ability to look like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, carrying a clipboard and a look of mild professional irritation. I found the service elevator and rode it to the 4th floor, the ballroom level. The doors opened to a hallway lined with racks of gala programs and crates of expensive glassware. I stepped out, blending into the frantic energy of the catering staff. I found a vantage point behind a heavy velvet curtain that overlooked the main ballroom floor. The noise hit me first, a cacophony of clinking crystal and the low, rhythmic thrum of a DJ who knew exactly how to keep a crowd in a state of agitated excitement. I located Tessa within seconds. She was at a circular table near the stage, surrounded by the sponsors, men and women in sharp charcoal suits who looked at her not as a person, but as a high-performing asset. These were the people who provided the lifestyle she flaunted. They funded the pool she neglected, the clothes she wore like armor, and the distance she had placed between herself and her family. I took out my phone and accessed the hotel's public Wi-Fi. I had spent the last 3 hours preparing a very specific package of information. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was a slow burn sequence. I had compiled the time-stamped footage from our home security system, the clips of Tessa leaving Sullivan alone, the clips of Derek's SUV idling in our driveway during my shifts, and the logs of her business expenses that were actually receipts for hotel rooms across the state. I hadn't changed a single frame. I didn't need to. Truth is the most effective accelerant when a reputation is built on falsehoods. I began the first phase of the ventilation. I didn't send the files to her followers. Not yet. I sent them to the private emails of the 3 lead sponsors sitting at her table. I watched them through my binoculars. At first, nothing happened. The gala continued in its glittering, hollow rhythm. Then, the man to Tessa's right, the CEO of a major athletic wear brand, felt his phone vibrate on the table. He picked it up with a casual, bored expression. I watched his brow furrow. He leaned in, his thumb scrolling through the high-definition images of his primary brand ambassador appearing to neglect a child while a stranger entered her home. He whispered something to the woman next to him. She pulled out her own device. The atmosphere at the table shifted. It was subtle, like the way the air pressure changes right before a storm breaks. The laughter became forced. The sponsors began to exchange looks that were no longer supportive. Tessa, sensing a change in the wind, redoubled her efforts. She leaned forward, her smile widening, her gestures becoming more frantic. She was performing for an audience that had already seen the man behind the curtain. Her smile faltered for the first time in 5 years. I whispered to the empty hallway. I moved to the next phase. I had access to the gala's digital program, a live updating feed that displayed sponsor messages and shout-outs on the massive LED screens flanking the stage. It was a simple system, designed for convenience, which made it incredibly fragile. Using the credentials I'd harvested from Tessa's own laptop, I logged into the back end of the event's media server. I didn't replace the gala's logo with anything dramatic. I simply added a new slide to the rotation. It was a photo of Sullivan sitting alone on his bed, clutching his broken dinosaur, with a caption that read, "The balance behind the brand, 8:12 p.m. tonight." I watched the screens. The slide flashed up for exactly 5 seconds before the system cycled to the next sponsor. It was just enough time for a few hundred people to see it, to whisper, and to pull out their phones to search for the context. I saw the ripples move through the crowd. The influencer tables were the first to react. These were people who lived and died by the scoop, and they were seeing a crack in the armor of one of their own. Below me, Tessa was starting to look around. She felt the eyes on her, but she didn't know why. She looked at Derek, who was frantically typing on his tablet, his face pale under the ballroom lights. He had finally noticed the glitch on the screens, but by then, the emails had already done their work. I felt a surge of cold, clinical satisfaction. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about restoration. In my line of work, we sometimes have to perform a controlled burn. You set a fire on purpose to consume the fuel and stop a larger, more destructive blaze from spreading. Tessa's ambition was the blaze, and it was threatening to consume Sullivan. I was just removing the fuel. I slipped back toward the service elevator. I had more to do. I had already contacted a legal firm specializing in emergency custody. They had the footage. They had the logs. They had the testimony of a neighbor who had seen the neglect firsthand. While Tessa was busy trying to save her brand in a ballroom full of strangers, I was building a fortress around our son that she would never be able to breach. As I reached the loading dock, I saw a black SUV scream into the parking lot. It was Derek's vehicle, but he wasn't driving. A courier hopped out and ran toward the service entrance with a frantic energy. The panic was setting in. The corporation was realizing its assets were toxic. I climbed back into my truck and pulled away from the curb. I didn't look back at the marquee. I didn't need to see the final collapse to know it was happening. Instead, I drove toward the quiet, dark suburb where my son was sleeping. I thought about the way Tessa had looked on the screen, the emerald dress, the perfect hair, the absolute confidence that she was the one in control. She thought she was the protagonist of a grand digital epic. She didn't realize that in the real world, the people who actually keep things running aren't the ones in the spotlight. They're the ones in the shadows, holding the blueprints and knowing exactly which wall to knock down to keep the whole ceiling from falling in. I checked my phone one last time before I reached the house. Tessa's live stream had ended abruptly. Her latest post was flooded with questions she couldn't answer. The sponsors had already begun removing her image from their official websites. It was a digital erasure, a systematic dismantling of a person built out of pixels and promises. I pulled into my driveway and saw Claire sitting on her porch, a silent sentry in the dark. I gave her a small nod. She nodded back, a look of grim understanding passing between us. I walked into the house. The scent of her perfume was still there, lingering in the hallway, but it felt thinner now, more like a memory than a presence. I went to Sullivan's room and checked on him. He hadn't moved. He was safe, tucked into a world where dinosaurs and pancakes were the only things that mattered. I sat in the dark of the living room and opened the legal files one more time. The battle for the house and the assets would be long and messy. She would fight, not out of love, but out of a desperate need to maintain the illusion of her perfect life. But I had the evidence, I had the truth, and most importantly, I had the initiative. And tomorrow, the world would wake up to a different version of Tessa Knox, and she would wake up to the realization that the man she had dismissed as a supporting character had just rewritten the entire script. I felt a vibration in my hand. A message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. It was a single sentence, sent from a burner account I didn't recognize. "You think you're the only one who knows how to watch?" I looked out the window at the empty street. The shadows felt a little longer than they had a moment ago. The first layer of revenge was complete, but the structure of this betrayal was deeper than I had imagined. There were more people in the house than I had accounted for. The cryptic message on my phone glowed like a radioactive coal. I stared at the screen, the blue light etching itself into my retinas while the rest of the house remained shrouded in the heavy velvet of 2:00 a.m. In the fire service, we call it a backdraft. The moment you think a fire is contained, only for a fresh supply of oxygen to turn the entire structure into a furnace. I had assumed this was a two-person play starring Tessa and Derek, with me as the disgruntled stagehand. But that message suggested a ghost in the machine, someone standing in the wings who had been watching the watchman. I didn't reply. In a high-stakes psychological environment, silence is the only armor that doesn't show its seams. I set the phone face down on the granite counter and walked to the window. The street was a study in suburban stillness, but the shadows between the oak trees seemed more substantial than they had an hour ago. My mind began to sift through our inner circle, the people who had access to our schedules, our codes, and our confidence. It was a short list, and every name on it felt like a fresh bruise. The next morning, the digital fallout from the gala began to settle like ash. Tessa had slipped into the house at dawn, her emerald dress wrinkled and her mascara streaked in a way that no filter could fix. She didn't speak to me. She went straight to the guest room and locked the door, a tactical retreat. I didn't press her. I had a different theater of operations to attend to. I drove Sullivan to his soccer practice at the community fields. It was a calculated move. I knew Derek Lawson would be there, whistle around his neck, pretending to be a pillar of the community while his professional world disintegrated. I parked my truck near the equipment shed, positioned so I could see the entire field. As I walked Sullivan to the grass, I felt the eyes of the other parents. The gala glitch had gone viral in the local circles. The whispers followed us like a draft. Derek saw me coming. He was mid-drill, demonstrating a foot trap to a group of 5-year-olds, but his body language shifted the moment he spotted my gait. He stood up straighter, his jaw tightening. He looked like a man who was trying to project strength while his foundation was liquefying. "Wilder," he said, his voice tight. "Didn't expect to see you here today." I never miss a practice, Derek. You know that. Consistency is everything. I leaned against the chain-link fence, my arms crossed. I was wearing my station jacket, the heavy navy fabric a stark contrast to his sleek, branded athletic gear. "Rough night at the gala? I heard there were some technical difficulties." He forced a laugh, a dry, hollow sound. "Glitches happen. Tech guys are looking into it." "Good, because some of that footage looked pretty personal. Hard to explain to the board of directors how a brand ambassador leaves a child unattended near a pool while a soccer coach parks his SUV in the driveway at midnight." I lowered my voice, making it soft, almost conversational. "You've worked hard for this career, Derek. It would be a shame to see it go up in smoke because of a lapse in judgment." I didn't wait for a response. I walked back to the parents' bench and sat down. I wasn't there to cause a scene. I was there to be a presence. Fear is a pressure cooker. If you don't provide a vent, the internal stress eventually causes a mechanical failure. I watched him for the next hour. He fumbled his whistle. He lost track of the drills. He kept glancing toward the parking lot as if expecting a process server to appear out of the tall grass. While the kids ran circles, I pulled out my phone and checked the burner account that had messaged me. I began to cross-reference the IP address with the login logs from our home network. I had installed a secondary monitoring layer months ago when the Wi-Fi started acting sluggish. Most people think they're being clever when they use a VPN, but every connection leaves a footprint, a thermal signature in the digital snow. The trace led back to a device that had been authorized on our home network for years. It wasn't a stranger, it was Marcus. Marcus had been my best friend since the academy. He was the man who stood behind me at my wedding, the man who had been in the trenches with me during the downtown high-rise fire 3 years ago. He was the person I trusted to watch my back when the ceiling was sagging. The realization didn't feel like a sudden shock. It felt like a slow, freezing realization that the floor I was standing on had been rotted through for a long time. I thought back to the last 6 months, the times Marcus had stopped by when I was on a 24-hour shift, the way he always knew exactly when Tessa was busy with her meetings. He wasn't just a friend, he was the conduit. He was feeding her information about my movements, my suspicions, and likely helping her navigate the very security systems I had installed to keep our family safe. I felt a cold, analytical fury. In the fire service, the worst kind of person is the one who sabotages the equipment. I waited until practice ended. I saw Derek trying to make a quick exit, but I intercepted him near the water coolers. I didn't touch him. I didn't need to. I simply held up my phone, showing him a draft of an email addressed to the Regional Soccer Association, a detailed report of his conduct, backed by the footage I had gathered. "This stays in the drafts for now," I said. "But I need something from you, Derek, and if you lie to me, I'll hit send before you reach your car." He looked like he was about to collapse. "What do you want?" "The login for the private server Marcus set up for you and Tessa, the one where you kept the backup files." He hesitated for only a second. "The loyalty among thieves is a very thin thread when the prospect of professional ruin is involved." He rattled off a sequence of letters and numbers, his voice trembling. I typed them in. The portal opened. It was worse than I thought. It wasn't just an affair, it was a coordinated effort to move assets out of our joint accounts. Tessa had been funneling money into a separate entity managed by Marcus, a consulting firm that existed only on paper. They were planning to leave me with the mortgage and the debt while they walked away with the liquid capital. They were going to dismantle my life while I was out putting out literal fires. I walked Sullivan to the truck, my mind working through the geometry of the next move. I needed to confront the mole, but I needed to do it in a way that left him no room to maneuver. I called Marcus. "Hey, Wilder," he said, his voice sounding entirely too normal. Heard about the gala. Crazy stuff, man. Tessa okay? She's fine, Marcus. Listen, I'm having some trouble with the house server. I think someone hacked the Ring cameras. Can you swing by? I need a second pair of eyes on the code. Sure thing, brother. I can be there in 20. I went home and prepared the kitchen. I didn't bring out the evidence. I didn't make a grand display. I simply sat at the table with 2 mugs of coffee. When Marcus walked in, he looked concerned, the perfect mask of a loyal friend. He sat down, his posture relaxed, his hands open and honest on the table. So, what's the issue? He asked, leaning toward me. The issue is the ventilation, I said. You know how it is in a basement fire. If you don't control the flow, the heat just builds up behind the door until it explodes. You've been opening doors for Tessa, Marcus, doors I thought were locked. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Marcus didn't move. He didn't blink. The mask didn't slip. It just solidified into something harder. I don't know what you're talking about, Wilder. You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you're seeing things that aren't there. I saw the logs, Marcus. I saw the consulting firm deposits. And I saw the message you sent me last night from the burner account. You think you're the only one who knows how to watch? That was a mistake. You got arrogant. You thought I was too busy crawling through smoke to notice the person standing behind me. I slid my tablet across the table. It showed the direct link between his personal device and the server Derek had just given me up for. Marcus looked at the screen. Slowly, he leaned back in his chair. The friendly neighbor persona evaporated, replaced by a cynical, jagged edge. She was unhappy, Wilder. You're never there. You're always at the station or sleeping off a shift. She wanted a life that was more than just waiting for a man who smelled like charcoal. I just helped her realize it. And the money? Did you help her realize she needed to take Sullivan's college fund too? That's just business. You wouldn't understand. You're a public servant. You're built for sacrifice. We're built for more. I nodded slowly. I appreciate the honesty. It makes the next part much easier. What next part? You going to report me to the department? It's your word against mine, and I've got 20 years of clean service. I don't need the department, I said. I stood up and walked toward the door. I've already redirected the consulting funds back to the original accounts, with an additional flag for the IRS regarding the undeclared income. And as for your clean service, I think your wife might be interested in the messages you've been sending to the other influencers in Tessa's circle. You weren't just helping Tessa, Marcus. You were using her network to build your own little harem of clients. Marcus's face went from pale to a sickly mottled gray. He stood up, his chair screeching against the tile. You didn't. I did, and I sent a copy of the server logs to your sergeant. Not as a formal complaint, just as a concerned friend worried about your digital security. The ventilation is open now, Marcus, and the fire is moving your way. I walked him to the door. He didn't say a word as he left. He looked like a man who had just realized the structure he was standing in was fully involved, and the exits were already blocked. I leaned against the doorframe, watching his car pull away. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I felt the same cold, quiet precisions I felt when I was standing on a roof with an axe, knowing exactly where to cut to save the rest of the block. The betrayal was deeper than I had imagined, but the revenge was becoming a work of art. I had neutralized the coach and the mole. Now, all that remained was the architect herself. I looked up at the window of the guest room. The light was on. Tessa was finally awake. The atmosphere in the house had become a heavy, physical thing, like the pressurized air inside a building just before a flashover. Tessa remained barricaded in the guest room, but her presence was a constant, irritating hum behind the drywall. I didn't need to see her to know she was frantic. The silence from her phone, the lack of notifications, the absence of the constant pings that usually punctuated her existence, was louder than any shouting match we'd ever had. I sat at the kitchen island, a cup of lukewarm coffee in my hand, watching the sunrise stretch its long, inquisitive fingers across the marble. I was no longer just a husband or a firefighter. I was a technician of consequences. In my line of work, we are taught that every action has a reaction, every fuel source has an ignition point, and every structure has a vulnerability. Tessa's life was built on a foundation of digital approval and material status. To dismantle it, I didn't need to be loud. I just needed to be thorough. I began with the physical assets. Tessa had always been obsessed with her car, a sleek white European SUV that she treated as a mobile studio for her on-the-go content. It was a lease, paid for by a local dealership in exchange for a specific number of monthly mentions. I pulled the contract from our shared digital files. There was a clause buried in the fine print regarding the moral standing and reputational integrity of the representative. I drafted a short, professional note to the dealership manager, attaching a few selected stills from the security footage of Derek's SUV at our house, while Tessa was under contract to represent family values and domestic excellence. I didn't ask them to take the car. I simply provided the information. I knew the corporate mind. They would move to protect their asset before the ink on my email was dry. Next, I turned my attention to the house itself. The Knox home was a smart home, a marvel of integrated technology that Tessa had insisted on to make her life easier. She could control the lights, the locks, the temperature, and the security cameras from her phone. But as the one who had actually installed the hardware and configured the hub, I was the one with the master administrative privileges. I began to introduce small, irritating glitches. It started with the thermostat. I set a program to fluctuate the temperature by 5 degrees every 20 minutes, never enough to be alarming, but enough to ensure she was never truly comfortable. I adjusted the lighting presets. Every time she tried to use her ring light for a recovery video, the overhead LEDs would switch to a harsh, flickering industrial hue, ruining the color balance. When she tried to access her primary cloud storage to delete the files I'd already harvested, she found the password had been changed. Not by me, ostensibly, but by a security protocol triggered by unusual activity. I watched her through the internal cameras as she finally emerged from the guest room. She looked diminished. Her hair was a mess, and the emerald dress had been replaced by a gray tracksuit that made her look like a ghost wandering through her own museum. She went straight for the coffee maker, but I had disabled the Wi-Fi on the appliance. She pressed the button, and it merely blinked at her with a dull red light. "Wilder," she called out, her voice raspy. "The internet is down, and the kitchen is freezing." "Must be the storm last night," I said, not looking up from my paper. "The grid is probably overloaded. I'll look at it when I get a chance." "I need to get online," she snapped, stepping into the kitchen. The desperation was starting to show through the cracks in her composure. "The sponsors are calling. People are saying things on the boards. I need to put out a statement." "A statement about what, Tessa? About how you left Sullivan alone so you could go to a party with his soccer coach? Or about the consulting firm you and Marcus set up to siphon off our savings?" She froze. The mention of the firm was the final blow to her remaining bravado. She sank into the chair opposite me, her hands trembling. "You don't understand how it works, Wilder. I was building something, for us, for our future." "You were building a fire, Tessa, and you forgot that I'm the one who knows how to read the smoke." The psychological pressure was only beginning. I had reached out to the fitness influencer community through a series of anonymous tips. I didn't leak everything at once. I fed them breadcrumbs. I highlighted the inconsistencies in her healthy lifestyle posts compared to the late-night receipts from fast food joints and high-end bars found in her car's center console. I pointed out the filtered nature of her unfiltered journeys. By noon, the very community she had cultivated was beginning to turn on her. The comment sections of her old posts were becoming a battlefield of accusations and disappointment. But the biggest betrayal wasn't the fame or the finances. It was the discovery I made while looking through her deleted emails from 3 months ago. There was a correspondence with a private school in a different city, one with a prestigious reputation and a hefty tuition. She had been applying for a position for herself as a brand consultant and had already inquired about a single student placement for Sullivan. She wasn't just planning to leave me, she was planning to relocate our son without my knowledge or consent, using the siphoned funds to disappear into a new life where I was nothing more than a footnote. The realization sat in my stomach like a cold stone. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment or a midlife crisis. This was a calculated long-term extraction. She had looked at our life, at our son, and seen only pieces she could move around a board. "I saw the school applications, Tessa," I said, my voice dangerously calm. She looked up, her eyes wide with a genuine raw fear. "I was going to tell you. Eventually. It was a better opportunity for him, Wilder. Better schools, better neighbors. You were going to take him, without a word. You were going to let me come home from a shift to an empty house and a for sale sign on the lawn. It wouldn't have been like that. It would have been exactly like that." I stood up, the chair scraping against the tile with a sound like a grinding gear. "But here's the reality. You aren't going anywhere. Not with him. I've already filed the paperwork. The footage of the pool, the gate, the neglect. That's not just evidence for a divorce. That's evidence for a custody hearing that you are going to lose." Tessa began to sob, a loud, ugly sound that lacked the grace of her usual on-camera performances. It was the sound of a person who had finally realized that the world didn't revolve around her narrative. Just then, the front door rattled. Through the side window, I saw the tow truck from the dealership. The manager had moved faster than I expected. 2 men in jumpsuits were already hooking up her white SUV. "What is that?" she gasped, running to the window. "Wilder, what are they doing?" "They're protecting their brand," I said. "Just like you were protecting yours." She watched as her prized possession was hoisted into the air. The vehicle she had used to project a life of luxury was being carted away like a piece of junk. It was a physical manifestation of her crumbling status. I went to the living room and found Sullivan playing with his blocks. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and curious. "Is Mommy crying?" "She's just having a hard day, pal," I said, sitting on the floor with him. "But don't worry, I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." I felt a vibration in my pocket. It was a message from Claire. "The news trucks are starting to circle the neighborhood. Someone leaked the story about the gala and the local connection. You okay?" I looked at the house, the beautiful empty shell of a life we'd built. The storm was no longer just inside the walls, it was at the gates. The public reveal I had orchestrated was taking on a life of its own. Tessa's humiliation was becoming a spectacle, a feeding frenzy for the very people who had once idolized her. I looked at Tessa, who was now slumped against the window, watching the tow truck disappear around the corner. She looked like a structural failure in progress. The load-bearing walls of her ego had collapsed, and the roof was coming down. I felt a momentary pang of something that might have been pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of Sullivan standing alone by the pool. In my world, you don't get a pass for endangering the innocent. You don't get to walk away from the damage you've caused just because you have a pretty face and a few thousand followers. "There's more coming," I said, more to myself than to her. The next phase of the reveal was scheduled for the evening news. I had provided a local investigative reporter with the full dossier on the consulting firm and Marcus's involvement. It wasn't just about Tessa anymore. It was about exposing the whole ecosystem of betrayal. I was going to ensure that by the time the sun went down, there wouldn't be a single person in this city who didn't know exactly who she was. I picked up a block and added it to Sullivan's tower. It was steady, it was solid, it was built on a foundation of truth. Tessa turned away from the window, her expression hardening into a mask of spite. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you can just erase me? I'll find a way back. I always do." "You can try," I said, not looking up. "But remember what I told you about ventilation, Tessa. Once the fire finds a way out, there's no putting it back in the box. You've lost the oxygen, and without that, there's nothing left to burn." I heard her footsteps retreating back to the guest room, the door slamming with a finality that echoed through the hollow house. I looked at Sullivan and smiled. We were in the eye of the storm now, the calmest part of the disaster. But I knew the back half of the hurricane was coming, and I was ready for it. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of impending rain and the distant electronic hum of the city. I sat in the cab of my truck, parked a strategic distance from the Elevate studio, a converted industrial warehouse where the elite of the local influencer scene gathered for their monthly live-streamed summit. Tonight was supposed to be Tessa's triumphant return, her chance to reclaim her narrative after what her remaining PR contacts were calling a technical smear campaign. She didn't know that I was the one who had invited the local news crews, and she certainly didn't know that I had spent the afternoon sitting in a quiet office with a forensic accountant. I watched the entrance through my side mirror. A line of sleek vehicles idled at the curb, discharging people who looked like they were made of plastic and light. Tessa arrived in a black car, a rental, I presumed, since the dealership had reclaimed her pride and joy. She stepped out, her chin tilted high, wearing a white suit that shouted innocence and new beginnings. She was a professional at the pivot. Even as her world crumbled, she was looking for a way to monetize the ruins. I opened my laptop on the passenger seat. The Elevate event was being broadcast live on several platforms, and the viewer count was already climbing into the tens of thousands. The comments section was a chaotic blur of support, vitriol, and confusion. I had one more piece of the puzzle to place, and it was the most difficult one. While digging through the consulting firm records Marcus had helped facilitate, I had found a third name. It wasn't Derek. It wasn't a sponsor. It was someone who had been in my house every week for 3 years, someone who knew Sullivan's allergies and my shift schedule better than anyone. Claire Benton, my neighbor, the intuitive woman who had warned me about the pool. The realization had settled over me like a layer of heavy soot. Claire hadn't been watching the house to protect me. She had been the primary lookout for Tessa. She was the one who texted Tessa when my truck pulled into the driveway. She was the one who had helped facilitate the move of the physical assets, using her garage as a staging area for the items Tessa was planning to take to her new life. The warning about the pool had been a tactical maneuver, a way to establish her own credibility and keep me focused on Tessa while the larger plan remained hidden. I looked at the house across the street on my internal security monitor. Claire's lights were off, but I knew she was watching the live stream. She was waiting for the reclamation to succeed so she could collect her percentage of the diverted funds. "Time for the main event," I whispered to the empty cab. I logged into the event's production feed using a backdoor Marcus had left open. Arrogance truly is the most common ignition source for a scandal. The summit was reaching its peak. Tessa was on stage, sitting in a plush velvet chair, a microphone clipped to her lapel. The moderator was tossing her softballs, giving her the space to paint herself as a victim of a malicious hack and a controlling domestic environment. "It's been a difficult few days," Tessa said, her voice trembling with a perfectly rehearsed tremor. "But I've realized that my platform is about more than just fitness. It's about the strength to stand up when people try to pull you down. My family, my son, they are my world, and I won't let a few distorted images change that." I waited for the perfect beat. As she began to talk about her unwavering commitment to honesty, I hit the sequence I had programmed. The large screen behind her, which was currently displaying a montage of her inspirational quotes, flickered. It didn't go dark. Instead, it began to play a split-screen video. On the left was the footage of Sullivan by the pool, the gate wide open, with a clear timestamp from the night of the gala. On the right was a series of screenshots from the consulting firm ledger, showing Claire Benton's name and the specific payments made for logistics and surveillance. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a structural collapse, where the dust is still hanging in the air and everyone is too stunned to move. Tessa froze, her mouth still open, her eyes reflecting the evidence of her own duplicity. The moderator looked off camera, frantically gesturing for a cut, but I had locked the control room out. Then, the final blow. I uploaded the audio file Marcus had recorded, a conversation between Tessa and Claire from 2 weeks ago. "Wilder won't even know the house is empty until he gets off the morning shift," Tessa's voice echoed through the warehouse and through the speakers of thousands of smartphones. "By then, the accounts will be clear, and Sullivan will be halfway to the new school. He's too slow to catch up." "And the neighborly act?" Claire's voice asked, sounding amused. "You sure he buys it?" "He's a firefighter, Claire. He's trained to look for fires, not the person holding the match." On the live stream, I watched the color drain from Tessa's face until she was as white as her suit. The audience in the warehouse began to murmur, then to shout. The cameras, sensing the shift in the narrative, zoomed in on her. The Elevate Summit was no longer a platform for her recovery. It was a televised autopsy of her reputation. I shifted my focus to the street. A news van was already pulling up to the warehouse. Reporters were spilling out, their microphones ready. Tessa's sponsors, who were likely watching from their own homes, were probably already drafting the termination of contract emails. The consulting firm was no longer a secret, and Claire Benton's role as the lookout was now public record. I felt a vibration in my hand. A call from Marcus. I ignored it. I had already delivered his files to the authorities. He was just a man trying to bargain for a life that was already forfeit. I looked at the screen one last time. Tessa was being ushered off the stage by security as the crowd became increasingly agitated. She looked small. She looked like a person who had spent her life building a palace out of shadows, only to have someone turn on a spotlight. I put the truck in gear and began to drive. I didn't head for the warehouse. I didn't need to see her face to know the damage was done. I drove toward the station. I had a shift starting in an hour, and there was a comfort in the familiar weight of the gear and the simple, honest mission of saving what could be saved. As I drove, I thought about the absurdity of it all. People spent so much time crafting a version of themselves for the world to see, protecting a brand that was as fragile as a pane of glass. They forgot that the real world doesn't care about your highlights. The real world cares about the load-bearing walls. It cares about whether you stay when the smoke gets thick or if you're the one who left the gate open. I pulled into the station parking lot. The guys were already there, the bay doors open, the smell of diesel and industrial soap filling the air. It was a grounded, physical world, a place where your worth was measured by your actions, not your followers. I checked my phone before going inside. The news was already breaking. Influencer scandal, neglect and financial fraud exposed. Tessa's face was on every local site, but the white suit didn't look like innocence anymore. It looked like a surrender. Claire Benton's house was being mentioned too. The reporters were at her door, asking about her involvement in the consultation scheme. The neighborhood she had used as her hunting ground was now the place where her own secrets were being aired. I walked into the locker room and began to change into my uniform. I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't possessed in years. The betrayal had been a massive, multi-alarm fire that had threatened to consume everything I valued. But I had used the tools I knew. I had controlled the ventilation, I had identified the fuel sources, and I had let the fire burn itself out. "Knox!" my captain called out, leaning against the doorway. "You okay? I saw the news." "I'm fine, Cap," I said, pulling my boots on and cinching the laces tight. "Just a little house cleaning. Everything's under control." "Good. Because we've got a report of a brush fire near the highway. High winds, dry grass. It's going to be a long night." "That's fine," I said, grabbing my helmet. "I'm good with long nights." I walked toward the engine, the familiar rhythm of the station taking over. The world of screens and filters felt like a dream, a loud, frantic dream that had finally ended. Sullivan was safe with his grandmother, the legal wheels were turning in my favor, and the people who had tried to dismantle my life were now busy trying to save their own. I climbed into the back of the engine, the seat vibrating as the massive engine roared to life. The lights began to flash, casting rhythmic splashes of red and blue against the station walls. We pulled out onto the street, the siren beginning its long, mournful wail. As we passed the turnoff for my neighborhood, I didn't look back. I looked forward, into the dark, into the wind, toward the next fire that needed to be put out. The revenge was complete, but the work never ended. And in that moment, with the wind in my face and the weight of the helmet on my head, I knew exactly who I was. The air in the suburban cul-de-sac was unnaturally still when I pulled my truck into the driveway for the last time. It was the kind of silence that follows a massive structural collapse, where the roaring energy has spent itself, leaving only the sound of cooling embers and the occasional shift of debris. The house, once a monument to Tessa's carefully curated brand, looked hollow. The for sale sign hadn't been hammered into the lawn yet, but the atmosphere of the place suggested it was already a ghost of a home. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine ticking as it cooled, and realized that for the first time in months, I wasn't scanning for threats. The threats had all been exposed to the light. I walked toward the front door, the weight of my keys in my hand feeling like an anchor rather than a burden. Inside, the house was stripped. In the 48 hours since the Elevate Summit disaster, the transformation had been total. The furniture remained, but the soul, the expensive candles, the framed motivational quotes, the high-end tech, had been packed away or seized. Tessa was in the living room, sitting on a packing crate. She wasn't wearing white anymore. She was wearing an old, oversized sweatshirt, her face devoid of the layers of makeup that usually served as her shield. "The lawyers called," she said, her voice sounding like dry parchment. She didn't look up. "They said the emergency hearing went exactly how you wanted it to, supervised visits only, for now." "It went how it had to go, Tessa," I replied, standing by the kitchen island that had seen the birth of my plan. "You can't leave a child by an open gate and expect the world to keep spinning in your favor. Actions have consequences. It's a basic law of physics." "You destroyed everything," she whispered, finally looking at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but the fire of her vanity hadn't quite gone out. It was just smoldering. "The sponsors, the house, Marcus, Claire. Even Derek won't return my calls. You didn't just leave me, Wilder. You erased me." "I didn't erase anything," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the sarcasm that usually defined my internal monologue. "I just removed the filters? I let people see the raw footage. If the truth destroyed your life, then your life was built on a lie. In the fire service, we don't blame the investigator for the damage the fire caused. We just report on the point of origin." She stood up, her movements stiff. "You think you've won. You think you're the hero of this story because you stayed in the soot while I tried to reach for something better. But look at you. You're alone in a house you can't afford, with a son who's going to grow up knowing his father dismantled his mother's life." "He's going to grow up safe," I countered. "And he's going to grow up knowing that the truth matters more than the number of likes on a screen. As for being alone, I've spent the last 5 years being alone in this marriage. This is just the first time the scenery matches the reality." I heard the front door open behind me. I didn't turn. I knew the cadence of the footsteps. It was Marcus. He looked like a man who had been through a centrifuge. His department blues were gone, replaced by a cheap windbreaker. The concerned friend mask had been permanently shattered, replaced by a look of desperate, cornered aggression. Behind him, leaning against the doorframe, was Claire. Her intuitive neighbor act had been replaced by a sharp, bitter resentment. "We aren't finished, Knox," Marcus said, his voice low. "You think those files you sent to the sergeant are going to stick? I've got 20 years of friends in that building. Your little digital stunt at the warehouse? That's harassment. That's interference." "It's evidence of a financial conspiracy, Marcus," I said, turning to face him. I felt a strange sense of detachment. I wasn't angry. I was just observing the final gasps of a dying fire. The IRS doesn't care about your 20 years of friends, and the department doesn't care about your loyalty when you're caught facilitating the theft of a fellow firefighter's assets. You weren't just a friend who made a mistake. You were the one who helped her try to take my son. We had a plan, Claire spat, her arms crossed tightly. We were going to get out of this stagnant little neighborhood. We were going to be the ones on top for once. You were always so smug, Wilder, so honest. You think you're better than us because you carry a hose? I don't think I'm better than anyone, I said. I just think I'm more durable. You three built a life out of paper and expectations. I build mine out of things that don't melt when the heat goes up. Tessa moved toward them, a small, desperate alliance forming in the center of the room. It was the inner circle, one last time, the architect, the lookout, and the mole. They stood together, a trio of people who had tried to rewrite my life for their own gain. Get out of my house, I said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command, delivered with the absolute authority of a man who had already seen the end of the movie. Your house? Tessa laughed, a jagged, unpleasant sound. The bank owns this house, Wilder, and without my income, you'll be out on the street in 3 months. I've already spoken to the bank, I said, and I've spoken to the realtor. We're short selling. I'm moving into a smaller place near the station, a place with a yard for Sullivan and no ring lights. I'm walking away from the debt, Tessa. And since the consulting firm funds were flagged as fraudulent, the court has frozen them as part of the divorce proceedings. You aren't getting that money, neither is Marcus, neither is Claire. The silence that followed was the sound of a total vacuum. The air left the room. Marcus took a step forward, his fists clenched, but he stopped when he saw me reach for my phone. I have the internal security system still running, Marcus. This entire conversation is being recorded and uploaded to a secure server in real time. If you take one more step, the police will have a very clear video of a former officer attempting to intimidate a witness in a pending fraud case. Is that how you want to spend the rest of your afternoon? Marcus looked at the small, glowing lens of the camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. He looked at me. The aggression drained out of him, replaced by a weary, pathetic sort of defeat. He was a man who had spent his life enforcing the rules, and he knew when the evidence was insurmountable. He turned without a word and walked out the door. Claire followed him, her head down, her neighborly facade gone forever. She didn't look back at the house she had helped betray. She just disappeared into the afternoon sun, a shadow merging with other shadows. Tessa remained. She looked at the empty spaces where her life used to be. She looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw the woman I had married, the person who existed before the filters and the fame. But that woman was gone, buried under layers of manufactured perfection and greed. I hate you, she whispered. I know, I said. But you'll find a way to make it sound like an inspirational journey. I'm sure there's a podcast out there looking for a story about a woman who lost everything and found her true self in the wreckage. She grabbed her remaining bag and walked out. She didn't say goodbye to the house. She didn't ask about Sullivan. She just left, her heels clicking on the hardwood until the sound was swallowed by the carpet of the entryway. I stood in the center of the living room for a long time. The house felt huge and quiet. I walked to the window and watched her car pull away. I saw the neighbors watching from behind their curtains, the same neighbors who had watched the news, who had whispered about the gala, who had seen the tow truck. The spectacle was over. The credits were rolling. I went to Sullivan's room. It was the only room that was still intact. I sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the triceratops I had fixed. Tomorrow I would bring him here to pack his things. We would go to the new place, a small, honest house with a porch and a view of the park. We would start over, not with a highlight reel, but with the day-to-day work of building something real. I felt a vibration in my pocket. A text from my captain. Shift starts in 4 hours, Knox. You ready? Ready, I typed back. I walked through the kitchen, turning off the lights as I went. I reached the hub for the smart home system, the digital heart of the house. I looked at the screen, at the complicated web of sensors and cameras I had used to dismantle my own life. With a single tap, I hit the factory reset. The screen flickered and then went dark. The hum of the servers died away. The house was just a house again. No more surveillance. No more hidden logs. No more secrets. I stepped out onto the porch and locked the door. The air smelled like rain now, a clean, sharp scent that promised to wash away the dust of the last few days. I walked to my truck, feeling the physical weight of the keys in my pocket. I wasn't the man I was 6 months ago. I was harder, perhaps more cynical, but I was also free. I started the engine and backed out of the driveway. As I reached the end of the block, I looked in the rearview mirror. The house looked small in the distance, a white box against a gray sky. It wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't a triumph. It was just a scene that had reached its natural conclusion. I turned the corner, heading toward the station, toward the sirens, and toward the only life I had left, one that didn't require a filter to be worth living. The fire was out, the smoke had cleared, and for the first time in a long time, I could breathe.